Hey everyone, let's talk about week 7 problematic computer mediated communication. I think this is probably arguably my favorite chapter. I feel like I say that often. I don't know, I just get really geeked out about this class, which I think is a good thing. But we have three sources of information that we take from. We have the Jones, Mitchell, and Finkelhor article. We have the Schmidt and Cohen book, and then we also have the Westerman, Bowman, and Lachlan book. But I want to start with the article because I think it starts with a lot of topics that maybe we're more familiar with, especially when it comes to this idea of online harassment. And it seems more and more prevalent that we're hearing about cyberbullying and online harassment. Actually, less now, and that's probably an agenda setting component, which we could talk about at another point. But we know that the youth, people that are online, are being harassed more simply because there are more people at that age that happen to be using the internet. We hear all these curmudgeons talk about, oh, I'm so upset that a young child, they're 6 years old, what do they need with an iPhone, right? And then we have the other side of the argument of, well, if everyone of their classmates has this technology, maybe they're falling behind. And so it's sort of a slippery slope either way when we talk about it. But we know more often than not, we look at least from the article's perspective, that indirect online harassment increased between 2000 and 2010, but direct online harassment did not. Ultimately, what I think that sort of alludes to is this notion that the direct harassment is less prevalent in the fact that we have these notions of subtweeting or mentioning people with vague booking, right? So we have different mechanisms, we have different platforms to communicate with people, but we can simply go ahead and roughly or vaguely talk about them. They talk about this idea of how do we really address this online harassment, and I think they bring up interesting ideas of we need to bring it into the schools, right? The two main ideas they talked about were this idea that we need educational programs that teach children social skills, which I was part of an organization that actually did that, so I inherently agree with that. But also this idea that there needs to be very clear policies on how online harassment is dealt with. And the policies being clear happens on two fronts, right? It happens from a legality and a legislation perspective. So when it does happen, we know how to approach the situation moving forward. But it also happens in the home. What are the parents going to do with that information? How is it that we use the likelihood, or how is it that we treat each other based on the likelihood of this online harassment? And ultimately, we look at these victims of online harassment and the idea that a lot of them are more likely than they used to be to report the problem to the staff of the school. So if we start establishing this criteria that this is what happens with cyberbullying, this is how we handle it. If you cyberbully someone, you get one strike, and then if you do it a second time, you get immediately expelled. Whatever the criteria is, we just need to be able to communicate it more effectively, which I feel is practical advice given a more theoretical approach to it. But it's just like the Schmidt and Cohen chapter where it starts talking about the way that online harassment and sort of the dark side of communication happens, in that we see massacres, and they talk about it on a genocidal scale, are becoming, or will become more hard to actually physically conduct. But we know that discrimination, since it can happen, on the smartphone, that discrimination can happen much more frequently, and it will become worse, and then of course more personal. And from that, we have two countries that are talked about within the chapter. We have Romania, whose government actually controls some of the personal information from, they estimate 2.2 million people in Romania. And the policy really manifests itself in separate education systems, economic exclusion, such as discriminating within hiring. So we see that Romania in particular is using this tactic to reduce the ability for people to go ahead and actually use computer-mediated communication. But we also see, not so much on the government end, but from the people end, we see this notion, which we talk about hopefully in our discussions, of online vigilantism, right? So people that are going and becoming Batman or Daredevil online. We see injustice happening, and so we start to take action. And examples that we even talked about last week is the notion of anonymous and what it is that companies or people will do to go ahead and find different individuals. The example that's talked about is the situation in China where the woman unfortunately kills a cat with her high-heeled shoe. I've seen it. I wouldn't recommend it, and at this point it's probably hard to find. But a bunch of people literally tracked this woman down in this small village that she lived in. And so it gets this notion that since anyone can really produce or share his or her perceptions or perspective on an event, it might help to nullify the claim. So if we see, oh, you did this act, but I have my 6 or 7 friends immediately come in and say, no, he was with me, or no, this didn't happen, then we start to look at these conflicting accounts and think about the lack of credibility, because it's hard to verify that information. And of course, we're not talking about it from a legal grand jury perspective, but just from a one-to-one perspective or one-to-many, ultimately the claims become devalued. It's harder for us to make these claims and justify them when other people are able to produce their own versions of the story. It's sort of the old adage of there are 3 kinds of truth. There's your truth, my truth, and the real truth, or the whole truth. And unfortunately, we see multiplicity being added to that. We see more people adding on their perceptions and their perspectives here. Just like with the Westerman, they started talking about the idea of the way that people consume media and how the consumption of media inherently impacts the relationship or their perceptions that they have of the world. And we could talk about the mean world syndrome, but the Caller and Morris in 2007 article, as quoted within Westerman, talks about this positive correlation between general television viewing and increased acceptance of rape myths, attributing the link to an increased sexual themed content of television. So essentially, people are seeing more within the general TV viewing habits. They're seeing more situations that have adult content, and as a result of it, there's a positive correlation between those variables. And we know that Gerbner talks about this with cultivation hypothesis and cultivation theory, the idea that television portrayals serve as a great storyteller for society, and that works in pro-social ways, right? We have young children watching television programs, and that's super helpful for them. They get to see a storyteller, they get to see a character, parasocial, relate to the character or feel connected to it. My dissertation and my master's thesis both look at parasocial relationships, so if you find those cool, come chat with me. But in general, the idea that people are likely to believe what they see on screen because these are sort of the sources of authority or credibility. And as a result, sometimes it has negative effects on people, such as the mean world effect and the mean world syndrome. The phenomenon by which individuals who watch a lot of crime shows or violence feel as though the real world is a dangerous and violent place. And that's not to say that the world isn't a dangerous and violent place, but instead that the time that we invest into this media may impact the way that we see the world, for better or worse. We can think of pro-social examples like the Soul City example, a South African television show that portrayed these HIV and AIDS infected characters. And so the knowledge that was gained from the show, we sort of coined it within the chapter, is this idea of edutainment, right? So you're being educated while you're also being entertained. And so during that process, what happens is that we actually are able to recognize and see content, see information, and be able to digest it. But if the cultivation hypothesis, what Gerbner proposed, is correct, since we see these television figures, whether it be a newscaster or just television programming in general, if we see them as credible and reliable sources, maybe in this situation we start to lose our own ability to formulate and think about these ideas. So again, we can talk in excess about the problematic forms of communication, why it is that we should be concerned about the way that maybe our grandparents or our kids or our friends or family, whoever it might be, they're consuming too much media and they start to become concerned. I think that's a reasonable place for us to start and question, is computer media communication theoretically impacting relationships in a negative way? And I think it's easier from our frame of reference to think about the negatives. Oh, my wife watches so much CSI, she just thinks that everyone's going to come out and murder her. I can't believe it. She doesn't even want to go out for dinner anymore. Okay, very extreme example, but it helps to really conceptualize this notion that there are people, even though we might not be impacted to the same degree, but there are people who genuinely think that the world is a bad place, or that their impressions are built off of a few sources of information. We think about the way that we select and actually obtain information. We usually pick the sources of that information, right? So if I am a Republican, I will go to foxnews.com. I'm not going to hop on MSNBC to find information. So the source is given a lot of authority and autonomy within that. As a result, what happens is that I will sit back and think, man, this source is telling me all this information. It must be true because they've broken every other story, and my grandparents are following this news source, and so I have all this sort of brand loyalty to it. So at the end of the day, just think about the ways that you consume media and are they problematic? We're going to have a little bit of self reflection as to the way that we communicate with people and the way that we access information online. But remember, try to look at this as objectively as possible. If you can, look at the way that you communicate, look at the way that maybe a close friend or close other communicates, and try to figure out what are the pro-social benefits of the way that you communicate and access information, and maybe what are the areas that you could improve. I'm not going to say the bad areas, the areas that you suck at, but instead, what are areas that maybe incrementally or over time you can change certain behaviors for a higher perk or higher benefit. Okay, so as we talk this week, problematic CMC. It's a lot of information, but I feel as though it is a good place for us to start thinking about our annotated bibliographies. And as you're going through that process and you have questions, of course, just let me know.